The western coast of Ireland, in the mid-16th century, was a place that did not belong to time. The land met the Atlantic not as a soft border, but as a wound, cliffs and salt, gray skies that hung like judgment, and a sea that could cradle you one moment and crush you the next. It was there, amid the roar of waves and the hum of Gaelic tongues, that Grace O'Malley was born into a world where men wrote the laws and the sea rewrote them. Her father, Eoin Dubdara O'Malley, was chieftain of a seafaring clan whose dominion stretched not across fields, but across tides, the lord of a coastline where castles faced the surf and galleys slipped through morning fog like knives. From the beginning, Grace, or Gran, as her people called her, understood that the ocean was both the kingdom and the battlefield. It was said that as a child she cut her hair short and disguised herself as a boy to join her father's voyages, defying the customs that tethered girls to the hearth. Her mother tried to chain her to embroidery and etiquette, but Grace's spirit was already fused with the wind. When she looked at the horizon, she did not see the end of the world. She saw roots, possibilities, and power. Ireland in her youth was not a nation, but a patchwork of rival clans, each fighting for survival under the slow tightening grip of the English crown. The Tudor monarchs called it taming the Wild West, but in truth, it was conquest by another name. The O'Malleys thrived in that chaos. They collected tolls from ships that passed their bays, offered protection for payment, and sometimes, when tribute was refused, took what they wanted by force. In that gray moral space between trade and piracy, Grace learned the laws of the sea, laws older than any crown. She was barely 16 when she married Donald O'Flaherty, heir to another coastal clan, in a union meant to bind power to power. But Grace did not marry to disappear behind a man. Donald's people quickly learned that the young bride with dark eyes and a sharper mind was not content to wait at home. When Donald was away, she managed fleets, negotiated ransoms, and settled disputes among her people. When he returned, he found his crew already loyal to her voice. The English governors heard whispers of a chieftain's daughter commanding ships along the Western Isles and laughed until they began losing vessels in her waters. Those who crossed her were found stripped of goods but spared their lives, as if the sea itself had passed judgment. Grace's reputation spread across the coasts. The girl who commanded men, who took no insult, who greeted danger with a smile as cold as the tide. When Donald was killed in a skirmish, some say ambushed by a rival clan, others say betrayed, Grace did not mourn in silence. She returned to her father's stronghold at Clare Island, gathered his ships, and declared herself leader of both O'Malley and O'Flaherty forces. No man contested it. The clans were weary of politics and hungry for results, and Grace delivered. She reorganized their fleet into squadrons, each commanded by captains loyal to her, and introduced strict codes of conduct, an unheard-of discipline among Irish chieftains. Traders sailing from Spain and Scotland began to pay tribute willingly, preferring the predictable law of the pirate queen to the chaos of rival raiders. Her ships, long narrow galleys powered by oars and sails, could strike fast and vanish faster. English officers called her the nurse of all rebellions, a phrase that was half accusation, half admiration. But Grace's story was not simply of blood and salt. In her castle halls, she fostered poets, scholars, and bards who carried the old Gaelic songs even as the English tried to erase them. She spoke Latin with priests, Gaelic with her people, and the blunt language of command with sailors. She was equal parts ruler and myth, her image flickering between history and legend even in her own lifetime. To the English, she was a pirate and a rebel. To her people, she was the sea made flesh, ungovernable, eternal. Yet behind that defiance was something deeper, an understanding that the age of chieftains was ending. The English had begun to redraw maps, replacing clan territories with royal counties, replacing Gaelic law with London's decrees. Grace saw the tide of empire rising and knew she could not stop it by strength alone. Her strategy shifted from raids to diplomacy, from open war to calculated survival. She forged temporary alliances with English lords when it suited her, offered hostages as gestures of peace, and broke those truces when betrayal came, which it often did. The English chroniclers, puzzled by her, wrote of her masculine boldness and monstrous nature, as if courage were a deformity in women. But what they could not record was fear, not hers, but their own. A woman who commanded ships, who made men kneel without a crown, unsettled the very order they built their world upon. She became both enemy and enigma, a ghost who haunted the empire's western frontier. Her fortress at Rockfleet stood like a defiant tooth against the Atlantic, and from its towers she could see the horizon burn with the setting sun, red as prophecy. In those years, her power peaked. She controlled trade routes along the western coast, extracted tolls from foreign merchants, and struck where English patrols grew lax. Yet every victory carved her name deeper into the ledgers of enemies who wanted her gone. In London, she became a problem, one that could not be solved by soldiers alone. The Crown would eventually send envoys, governors, and spies to negotiate, deceive, or destroy her, but none would succeed for long. For every fleet sent to crush her, a storm would rise. For every castle besieged, a truce would fracture. It was as if the sea itself refused to yield her up. But even legends have beginnings they cannot outrun. Somewhere between the surf and the smoke of burning villages, Grace began to feel the weight of time pressing against her rebellion. The English called it pacification. Her people called it the slow death of freedom. And Grace O'Malley, pirate, chieftain, queen of the Western Isles, stood alone at the edge of an empire she could not stop, staring out over waters that had once obeyed her command, knowing that soon the world itself would change, and she would either vanish beneath its tide or become part of its myth. If the sea had raised her, then betrayal refined her. By the time Grace O'Malley took full command of her fleets, Ireland was already caught in the tightening web of Tudor ambition. Elizabeth's empire stretched like an invisible tide, swallowing Gaelic lordships one by one, not with swords alone, but with paper, charters, land acts, and decrees that turned chiefs into tenants. For most, submission was survival. For Grace, submission was death. From her fortress at Rockfleet, she began reshaping her dominion into something neither Gaelic nor English, but something entirely her own, a floating kingdom bound by loyalty, fear, and profit. Her ships, sleek galleys powered by dozens of oarsmen, cut through Atlantic fogs like silver blades. They were painted black beneath the waterline to disappear into dusk, their hulls fitted for both trade and ambush. Her sailors came from every corner of the Irish West, deserters, fishermen, mercenaries, men who'd lost everything to English confiscations. To them, Grace was not a lady of bloodlines, but a commander who paid fairly and punished swiftly. She rewarded courage with gold and met treachery with the rope. In an age when women were barely allowed to inherit land, Grace commanded hundreds of men who would die at her word. Her leadership was not theatrical, it was absolute. She shared their rations, worked beside them in storm and hunger, and was known to steer a galley herself when tempest struck. There were tales of her standing at the bow during raids, sword drawn, cloak snapping like a black sail, shouting orders in Gaelic while cannon smoke rolled across the deck. To the merchants of Galway and Spain, she was both threat and ally. Her protection guaranteed safe passage, her wrath ruin. She levied tolls in the name of the O'Malley clan, but her reach extended far beyond clan borders. She became, in essence, a sovereign of the sea, an uncrowned monarch of the western waters, her fleet raided English supply ships bound for the fortresses of Connaught and redistributed their cargoes among her people, turning piracy into a form of rebellion. The English called her depredations insolence. Her followers called them justice. Yet her defiance was not reckless. Grace understood politics as deeply as warfare. She kept lines of negotiation open with English governors even as she plundered their convoys, writing letters in elegant Latin, sealing them with the O'Malley crest. To some, she appeared loyal, swearing fealty when convenient. To others, she was a phantom enemy who obeyed no law but the tide. Her greatest strength was her unpredictability. When the English expected war, she offered peace. When they sought peace, she struck like lightning. Even her personal life blurred the line between myth and strategy. After Donald's death, she married Richard Burke. Iron Richard, a formidable chieftain from Mayo. But the union was as pragmatic as it was political. The story goes that after 1 year of marriage, she dismissed him, declaring, "Richard Burke, I dismiss you," and kept his castle as her own, invoking the Gaelic law of 1-year trial marriages. Whether truth or legend, it embodied her philosophy. Power belonged to those who seized it. From that fortress at Rockfleet, she ruled as both lord and admiral, her authority recognized by allies and enemies alike. Her fleet numbered dozens of ships. Her influence stretched from Achill to Clare Island, and her coffers filled with silver from Spanish and Scottish merchants who found it wiser to pay her dues than fight her fury. But the greater her fame grew, the more dangerous her existence became. English governors like Sir Richard Bingham, a brutal soldier of the crown, viewed her not as a rival, but as a contagion. To them, she represented everything untamable in Ireland: defiance, independence, womanhood without permission. Bingham hunted her relentlessly, confiscating lands, arresting her sons, burning her villages. Still, she endured. There is a story, one of many, of Bingham soldiers besieging her at Rockfleet, only to find her gone at dawn. Her ships vanished into mist, her flags, replaced with seaweed, hung mockingly from the towers. Her survival was not luck. It was mastery of the landscape. Grace knew every inlet, every hidden bay, every shifting sandbar that could trap an English galleon. Her messengers moved faster than the crown's orders, carrying word across mountains and islands through secret networks of fishermen and monks. She fought not to win, but to last. Each year that she remained free was an act of defiance against an empire built on submission. Still, the cost was heavy. Her sons, Tibbet and Murrow, were drawn into the conflicts that shadowed her life. Tibbet, born aboard one of her ships during their voyage, grew up as both warrior and hostage, a pawn in England's slow chess game. Her husband's loyalty wavered under pressure. Some allies turned to the crown for titles and safety. The tide, for the first time, seemed to shift against her. But Grace O'Malley had long learned that survival required transformation. When her fleets were cornered, she adapted, trading piracy for privateering, violence for negotiation. She offered her services to the crown in exchange for protection, even as she plotted her next rebellion. She wrote directly to Queen Elizabeth I, the only ruler she ever acknowledged as her equal, bypassing the governors who sought her death. Her letter was bold, articulate, and audacious, a Gaelic chieftainess appealing to the English queen as one monarch to another, invoking mercy and justice in the same breath. Historians still marvel at its tone, not supplication, but parody. It was not the letter of a subject, it was the declaration of a sovereign. And Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, saw something of herself in the woman from the West. Two queens, one who ruled an empire from marble halls, another who ruled from storm-racked cliffs, both navigating a world that doubted their right to power. The stage was set for a meeting that should never have happened, a collision of worlds at the heart of an empire. But before they would face each other, the seas would again run red, and Grace would have to gamble everything, her fleet, her family, her name, for one final chance to survive in a world built to erase her. Women knew they had brokered an unspoken truce, two queens acknowledging one another across the wreckage of their realms. For Grace, it was a victory carved from ruin. For Elizabeth, it was a way to pacify the West without more bloodshed. Yet even as she sailed home, Grace must have sensed the truth, that her time was ending. The seas no longer belonged to free captains and clan fleets. They belonged to empires and navies. The Gaelic order that had sustained her was dissolving under the weight of conquest. When she returned to Ireland, her power was symbolic, her fleets scattered, her enemies triumphant. And yet, she did not vanish quietly. For years after her audience with Elizabeth, she continued to command trade routes, mediate disputes, and shelter fugitives. Her final years are a fog of rumor. Some say she died peacefully at Rockfleet, others that she vanished at sea during a storm, her ship never found. There are even tales of her burial on Clare Island, her tomb facing the open water, as if waiting for one last voyage. What is certain is that by the time the next century dawned, her name had begun to fade. English chroniclers wrote her out of the records, reducing her to a footnote of rebellion. Her letters disappeared, her victories attributed to men, her story recast as folklore. But among the fishermen of Connaught, her legend lived on. They told of a woman who commanded the ocean's will, whose ships appeared in moonlight whenever Ireland was in peril. Some swore they still saw her galley in storms, a black silhouette riding the waves, eyes of fire beneath her hood. History forgot Grace O'Malley, but the sea did not. And somewhere beyond the reach of empire, her ghost still sails, unbroken, untamed, forever the queen who refused to kneel. In the centuries that followed her death, the name Grace O'Malley dissolved like salt in the tide. Her castles crumbled into mossed ruins, her fleets rotted into the seabed, and her story, once whispered from island to island, was buried beneath the empire's new language of conquest. The English chroniclers who rewrote Ireland's past painted her not as a queen, but as a pirate, a bandit, a relic of barbaric times. To them, she was an embarrassment to civilization, a woman who dared to rule without a man's permission. Her legacy was quietly erased from court archives and ship registries, her correspondence with Elizabeth I lost or misfiled, her portraits replaced by rumor. Even Irish scholars of later generations, seeking legitimacy under British rule, distanced themselves from her, calling her tales exaggerations of peasant myth. The world forgot that she had once stood face to face with a queen and won, but memory has a way of surviving where ink fails. Along the western coast, her story lingered not in books, but in the mouths of those who still worked the sea. Fishermen sang of Grainmawel, the sea queen, who ruled the waves and robbed the English without fear. Her name became a warning and a blessing. Mothers told their children that when storms rose too suddenly, it was Gran, testing the courage of the living. Sailors poured a drop of whiskey overboard before long voyages, whispering her name for luck. In some villages, people swore her ghost still protected lost ships, guiding them through fog toward safe harbor. Even her castles, though silent, carried her presence. At Rockfleet, locals said that if you stood by the sea gate at midnight, you could hear oars dipping in the water, her fleet returning home. Yet, for nearly 300 years, history forgot to listen. The 17th and 18th centuries belonged to the empire she had resisted, an empire that thrived on erasing those who defied its order. Women like Grace did not fit the story England wanted to tell of its civilizing mission. The archives spoke only of governors and generals, of laws imposed and lands subdued. Grace's rebellion became a ghost story, told in the vernacular, too wild for scholars, too dangerous for schools. By the time the 19th century dawned, Ireland itself was being rewritten, its language fading, its songs censored, its myths turned quaint. Yet something of her spirit survived in that defiance. When poets and revolutionaries of the 1800s began to dream of independence, they reached back through the ruins of memory and found her waiting. In the rebel songs of the Young Ireland movement, Grain Mowell returned not as a pirate, but as a symbol of Ireland herself, untamed, betrayed, enduring. Her story was reborn in whispers of resistance, her image carried on banners, her legend reshaped for a new age. She was no longer merely a woman who commanded ships. She was the embodiment of an unconquered spirit, a reminder that Ireland had once produced queens who answered to no crown. Yet even in this revival, the truth of her life remained elusive. Historians could find fragments, a letter here, a mention in a court record there, but never the whole tapestry. The meeting with Elizabeth I, once a matter of diplomacy, was recast as myth. Two queens locked in symbolic rivalry. Some said Grace refused to bow, others that she demanded equal recognition, others still that she concealed a dagger under her cloak, each retelling blurred fact with legend until even scholars could no longer separate the two. And perhaps that was fitting. Grace O'Malley had spent her life existing in that borderland between truth and myth, part noble, part outlaw, wholly sovereign. Her disappearance from the written record was not an accident. It was the continuation of her rebellion. To vanish was to escape. To become legend was to live forever. As the 20th century approached, Ireland began to reclaim her from silence. Historians pieced together her genealogy, tracing the O'Malleys to the lords of Umhale, confirming her lineage, her fortresses, her maritime power. Her letters to Elizabeth resurfaced in archives, their Latin still sharp and defiant. The myth of the pirate queen was replaced by the portrait of a strategist, diplomat, and commander who had balanced rebellion with negotiation in a world where women were denied both. Plays and novels resurrected her, each one shaping her differently. Sometimes as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ghost of vengeance, sometimes as a proto-feminist, centuries ahead of her time. But even in rediscovery, she remained slippery, refusing to fit comfortably into the categories of modern history, too ruthless to be sainted, too brilliant to be dismissed, too independent to be claimed by any ideology. She belonged to no one. That, perhaps, was her final act of sovereignty. Even as modern Ireland built monuments in her name, statues at Westport, plaques at Clare Island, tourist trails marking her castles, there lingered a sense that the real Grace O'Malley was still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of textbooks. The woman who commanded fleets, who defied empires, who met a queen on equal terms, could not be fully domesticated by memory. She existed in the gray between history and myth, where the wind never stops blowing and the sea never gives back what it takes. And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the Atlantic turns to pewter and the gulls cry like ghosts, there are still those who swear they see her galley cutting across the horizon, black sails against the silver sea, her figure at the helm, eyes fixed on a future that still refuses to kneel. The waves crash, the mist rolls in, and for a heartbeat, history remembers. Then she is gone again, the queen who commanded a fleet and vanished from history. In the end, Grace O'Malley's disappearance became her greatest weapon. What empire erased, legend remembered. What scholars dismissed, storytellers reclaimed. By the dawn of the 20th century, when Ireland once again trembled on the edge of revolution, her ghost returned in full force, not as a phantom haunting the waves, but as a symbol of the endurance of the unrecorded, the silenced, the defiant. Her name reappeared in newspapers, in the speeches of suffragists who looked to her as proof that Irish women had once ruled their own fate. Artists painted her with wind-swept hair and salt-stung eyes, standing alone on a cliff above a storm, a figure half history, half dream. To a nation struggling to remember itself, she was the embodiment of something older and purer, a time before borders, before laws written in foreign tongues, when the sea itself was Ireland's frontier. The academic rediscovery began quietly, almost accidentally. In 1910, an Irish antiquarian named Sir Richard Blake stumbled across her surviving correspondence in the state papers, a handful of Latin letters signed Grania O'Malley. What he read stunned him. Here was not the illiterate pirate of English myth, but an articulate, calculating leader, negotiating with the Queen of England on equal terms. The discovery shattered the colonial caricature. Over the next decades, historians dug deeper. They traced her family lines through the annals of the O'Malleys, confirmed her meeting with Elizabeth I, and mapped her fortresses at Clare Island, Rockfleet, and Kildavnet. Slowly, the woman behind the myth began to emerge, neither saint nor outlaw, but a strategist of survival. Yet, the more they uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. The archives were incomplete, the records contradictory. Her portrait, if it ever existed, was lost. No first-hand accounts of her voice, her laughter, her fears survived. It was as if the sea had swallowed her image, leaving only the wake. Filmmakers and writers filled that void with imagination. In the 1930s, nationalist poets invoked her as the Mother of the West, a warrior who fought not just for land, but for dignity. In the 1960s, as waves of feminism spread across the world, she was reborn again, this time as the Pirate Queen, a woman centuries ahead of her time who defied patriarchal power with audacity and intellect. Musicals, novels, and plays turned her into an icon, though often a sanitized one. In these retellings, her bloodier deeds were softened, her cunning recast as romance. The real Grace, the shrewd negotiator who could charm a queen and terrify a governor, remained hidden beneath layers of performance. But even that distortion had its own kind of justice. Every retelling, every dramatization, every song sung in her name was another act of resurrection. For the first time since her death, she could not be erased. And as Ireland entered the modern age, through war, partition, and independence, Grace O'Malley became more than a historical curiosity. She became a question. What other stories had the empire buried? How many queens, poets, and warriors had been reduced to footnotes because they did not fit the narrative of power? Grace's story became a symbol of all that history had chosen to forget, not just in Ireland, but everywhere women had ruled and been written out. Her face, imagined and reimagined, began to appear in murals and textbooks. School children learned of the Sea Queen of Connaught, though few were told how close she had come to vanishing completely. Even in the 21st century, new discoveries still surface. Archaeologists uncover remnants of her castles. Divers search the seabed for her lost ships. Linguists analyze her surviving letters for traces of her personality. What they find is always the same paradox. A woman both real and unreal, both documented and legendary. She exists just at the edge of certainty, too powerful to be forgotten, too elusive to be fully known. And perhaps that is why she endures. In every generation, she becomes what the age needs her to be. For the rebels, a patriot. For the feminists, a trailblazer. For the scholars, a puzzle. For the poets, a ghost. Her life becomes a mirror for the questions each era asks itself about power, freedom, and the price of survival. There is something almost prophetic about her vanishing, as if she understood that to live forever, she must first disappear. To be remembered, she must become ungraspable. The sea taught her that. The sea never holds still. It erases and renews in the same motion. So, too, did she. Her legacy rolls forward like a tide, retreating into myth, then surging back into history with each rediscovery. And when one stands on the cliffs of Clare Island today, facing the same gray horizon she once ruled, it is impossible not to feel her presence. The wind screams through the ruins of her stronghold. The Atlantic hurls itself endlessly against the rock. Somewhere below, invisible to the eye, lies the memory of her fleet, splintered, buried, yet eternal. The world she knew has long since drowned, but the defiance she carried has not. It lives in every act of rebellion, every refusal to kneel, every voice that dares to speak when silence is safer. That is her true legacy, not her ships, nor her castles, nor even her victories, but her refusal to vanish quietly. She disappeared from history's pages, yes, but not from its soul. And so, each time a storm rises over the western coast and the sea glows faintly in the dark, the fishermen still whisper her name into the wind, not as a prayer, as a promise, that the queen who commanded a fleet, the woman who faced an empire and vanished without bowing, still sails somewhere beyond the horizon, where the tide is forever turning, and history, at last, remembers her. It was said that after the fires dimmed on Clare Island and the sea calmed from its centuries of storms, there came a strange quiet, a silence that did not belong to Ireland's west coast, but to the memory of something deliberately forgotten. Grace O'Malley's name, once spoken in whispers by sailors who swore her flag had ruled the horizon, began to dissolve into rumor, her fleet into myth, her defiance into something too dangerous to repeat. The English records ended abruptly, as if history itself had chosen to look away, and what was left behind were fragments scattered between truth and superstition, a burial with no confirmed site, letters that vanished from royal archives, and a lineage that seemed to splinter into obscurity. Some said she died in her castle by the sea, watching the tide roll in one last time, her ships rotting in their moorings like old war horses turned to driftwood. Others swore she was seen years later, sailing under a false flag, her hair turned silver, her face hidden beneath the hood of an Irish cloak, leading a small band of survivors to some secret island where no tax collector nor crown could ever reach. The truth was that Grace had always belonged to the sea, and the sea has no need for tombstones. Those who went looking for her found only echoes, songs sung by fishermen who didn't remember the words, carved initials on timbers long since drowned, and the faint shape of her crest beneath layers of salt and moss. But the silence was not natural. Something about it felt intentional, as though someone, somewhere, wanted her story to vanish, erased not by time but by design. It was not uncommon in those years for powerful women to disappear in the folds of empire, their legacies rewritten or buried beneath the triumphs of men. The chroniclers who recorded the rebellions of Ireland's west coast named dozens of men, clan leaders, traders, chiefs, yet when they came to Grace, they wrote little. A notable woman of the O'Malleys, long in rebellion, one scribe noted, almost reluctantly, as though to acknowledge her too fully would risk reviving her. The rest was silence. And in that silence, myth began to grow. By the 1700s, the legend of the Pirate Queen was already shifting, shaped by fireside stories told by those who had never seen her. They said she could turn storms aside with her voice, that her ships vanished into fog when pursued, that she had met with Elizabeth not as a supplicant, but as an equal, and that after that meeting both women carried a shared secret neither ever spoke of again. No historian could verify it, but the tale persisted, that two queens, enemies in war,